screen. And I believe we're live. All right. Hi, everyone. All of our viewers out in archives and records management land. My name is Era Tansey, and I'm chair of the Society of American Archivists Records Management section. And I'd like to welcome you to one of our periodic hangouts. We do these on a fairly regular basis. And today, past chair Brad Houston is hosting today's hangout. Before I turn it over to Brad, hangouts are always a very interactive experience. We want your questions. So if you're watching on YouTube, there should be a chat box there. You can type in your question and we will make sure that we answer your question during the course of the next hour. Or if you are on Twitter, you can use the hashtag SAARMS and we will also be monitoring that. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Brad.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Houston. I am currently the Document Services Manager at the City of Milwaukee, which means I do the records management and document imaging and mailroom for some reason. But I am, pleased to have you join us for this hangout. We have a few practitioners from around the Southeast Wisconsin, Northeast Illinois area. We're going to talk to us a little bit about their experience as records managers outside of an archival context. I should preface that by saying that both of these folks have also worked within the archival context, but hopefully I think they still have a lot of good insight to give us about what records managers who don't have the direct archival connection, what wants the archivists who they nonetheless work with to know about what they're doing and what they want them to know about what they're doing. All right, so our panelists are Connie Schumacher. She is the content and records manager at Argonne National Laboratory. And Dennis Larsen, who is a retired records manager. He is a man of many hats. Most recently, he was the records manager for the University of Wisconsin Colleges and Extension. So I'll let Connie and Dennis introduce themselves briefly, talk a little bit about, what they have done in records management. So Connie, can you start us off?
Sure thing. I've been doing records-related activities since I got my master's degree, and the course of study was archives and museum management at Bowling Green State University. So I've been doing this for about 30 years, and I've had the opportunity to work in collegiate institutions, private industry, and now I am kind of circled back and I'm in a quasi-collegiate private research organization at Argonne National Laboratory.
Okay. Dennis, you want to talk a little bit about your records management background or other stuff that you want the audience to know?
Sure. I am a retired certified record manager is what I say. And I spent most of my career in public local government and in public university, as Brad was saying. I went to school in political science and a master's degree in urban affairs, which led me to work in local government, which I really wanted to do. And so I ended up being asked by someone in the high administrative position who, little did I know, had been involved in ARMA in the 1970s. And he said, well, I think you should do this. And I said, oh, I'll only do it if you get training money. And I thought it would just stop there. But they got me some training money, and I realized that things that needed to be done for Milwaukee County was something that I could start to do. And I ended up doing that full time for many years. I did that and promoted the records programming at Milwaukee County. Later, I did some part-time, well, I also went to private industry for a little while, and found out that that wasn't like working in the public sector. It wasn't as interesting in a way. And then I also worked part-time in university, and I also taught records management as an adjunct for about 20 years at UW Milwaukee. And so that was a very good experience for me. The whole career has been very good.
I just have to say that I used to work with Dennis, obviously, since I came from UWM. We were on the UW Records Officers Council together. And so it's weird to come to the city of Milwaukee and looking through some of my predecessors' historical records and saying, oh, I know that guy. Because, you know, the county and the city obviously work together on all sorts of issues, including records issues. So, all right. So we've got a few canned questions here for you guys, and then, as Era said, we're monitoring YouTube and Twitter for additional audience questions. So let's start with this first one. Can you guys talk a little bit about the legal and regulatory environments in which you either work or have worked, and to what extent has the participation of archives in that environment been present or absent?
Well, I guess I'll start. You know, when I started my career and moved to Chicago, I worked at the National Opinion Research Center, and that was at the University of Chicago. And they wanted an archive, but they were really not conscious of a lot of the legal requirements that protected records, you know, within the institution. After I was finished with NORC, I worked also with the Office of the Clerk of the Circuit Court of Cook County, and we were monitored by the Illinois State Court Association and also the Illinois Archive as well. So we had to comply with those two areas in terms of record keeping. Then I moved to Connecticut, and I worked for a pharmaceutical company, and we were highly regulated, both by the DOE, or excuse me, yes, I'm losing my train of thought. Well, we were highly regulated because of the products that we created by the Food and Drug Administration, but also by the Drug Enforcement Agency within the United States because of the products we created. So we had some very high-level compliance requirements that we had to accommodate from the United States government. And now that I'm at Argonne, we also fall under the auspices of the Department of Energy, and we have to comply with the National Archives and Records Service requirements. So those feed back into records that go across the entire enterprise here. And actually, the DOE has done a good job at setting retention periods for most of the records that we use at the National Laboratory here. So whether people are conscious of these things or not, there really is statutory requirement out there. And that's what I usually like to start with when I start to figure out what the keeping periods must be when I'm developing a records retention schedule. So mostly it's having chats with the business owners, getting them to acknowledge what kind of records they've got, and trying to come to some agreement on how long these records should be kept. And so, you know, we start with the legal requirement, but there may be other business needs that need to be married into the overall retention requirement. And so that's why it's really important to get input from the records owners so that you can capture that information.
Dennis? You have any thoughts on this?
Yep. Working in local government for a long time, we were very conscious of state and federal laws that we needed to pay attention to. There was quite a bit said in state statutes about various kinds of record keeping, and our connection to the state-sponsored Public Records Board it had some impact with us because we're a very large county. We did a lot of the rule making or retention scheduling on our own. We had special status in the statute for that. But as I was in there longer, the state became more interested in trying to have us participate with Public Records Board, which we tended to do. Although most of the things that we worked on, we had sort of a permission to do things unless we created schedules that were, I can't remember now, too long or too short or something like that. And so then we would do that. But it also connected us in a way that supported the programming to be able to say to people in local county offices, well, you know, the state says blah, blah, blah. The statute says blah, blah, blah. So this was very important. And the Code of Federal Regulations and things like that came into play a lot. But our committee, our own public records committee, made good advances with setting schedules. Also participating with that as part of the local records committee was the Milwaukee County Historical Society. So we always had some presence of them participating in establishing schedules and also procedurally to be considered when disposal was occurring as well. So, and we also had an obligation to notify the State Historical Society. So there was lots of chance for that. I did notice when I moved to private industry that things felt quite a bit different. There wasn't quite as much administrative thickness of things, which in a way was okay, but it also felt like it was a little more, you needed to sort of push procedure a little more so that people would do things properly. But it tended to work out and it had its own energy about it. In both settings, I found it interesting, challenging, and things like that. There was always legal matters to consider, and I liked having the participation of the Corporation Council at the county, which was required by our ordinance. Later, when I worked at as a records officer for the university, there the pattern was kind of similar to working in local government because we had that public records board to go to at the state level. So that was fairly consistent. Another thing I just wanted to mention is that in teaching class for the 2 decades that I did that, I always felt like because I was in the public sector a lot, I needed to relate to the students and say, you know what? A lot of records management and archives work goes on in private industry, and you should be set for that because your chances of being employed is that much greater. So it's a very important opportunity. And I consistently tried to teach from the point of view that records management and archives weren't a governmental, public, university kind of thing. They're for all, the whole society, including private industry. So I think that was a good message for students. I have lots of students that have worked in private industry now.
So sort of a follow-up question. Dennis covered
Yes.
this a little bit, but I'm interested in hearing Connie's thoughts about it too. In the various sectors that you have worked in, have you noticed, what kind of differences have you noticed in terms of either administrative or record creator attitudes towards records management and its necessity or relevance to the organization?
Some of the institutions that I worked for had archival records. Some of them were not interested in archival records, but what everybody was interested in at a fundamental level was how to make their work life easier. And so if I wanted to have an archive later on, I knew I had to make sure that I had to obtain capture. So what I really focused on, in industry, and at the clerk's office and at Argonne is setting up some, high-level rules and then some procedures for people to follow so that they could better organize their work product and we could start to apply retention to it. And I don't believe the rules were onerous, and people were appreciative because the endpoint for us was to make sure that the retention application happened on the back end so they wouldn't have to worry about this. So all I would tell people is if you can file with a purpose, a lot of the monitoring that will need to happen, you don't have to worry about. And because we built standardized records retention schedules, we had high-level vice presidents reviewing, the retention and keeping periods. We had the legal counsel review that as well, so we could get these schedules signed off, and we wouldn't also have to argue with people about keeping periods if they thought they were too short or too long. And the way I've constructed records retention schedules is that we have an archival component to that. So, we need to decide if the resource is going to be kept for a temporary period of time or a permanent period of time. And now that we've got that sort done, we can start to focus on what it's going to take to protect those records for long-term keeping. The thing that's important to me is that most of our collection, our input and our output now is all electronic. And so in my opinion, this is really a critical activity now, is to try to define, what's important for people and, help them get it better organized so that we can capture it and, address it.
So that's pretty sort of a good lead in to my next question, which is, how do both of you define archives or archiving in your situation? So what does it mean to archive something?
You want me to go on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I found it interesting that you talked about terminology because it's always something that has to be talked about, and I'm a strong believer in this. The term archives to me is always implying a physical space, a file drawer, a room, a building. And for me, in the work that I did, it was always also implying historical society, either local or state level. And it also implied other kinds of archive interests. But when we talk about archiving, if I talk to the man on the street, to a new student or something like this, and I say archiving, and they're not, let's say they're not majoring in archives, they often will think, oh, you're writing to a computer, you're sending it to the cloud or something like that. And that isn't what we mean in this context here, because that may or may not be actually appropriate in terms of what you want to do for having historical archives. So so it just has a different sense about it. So terminology is important, I think.
Well, I guess I'll, leverage, what Dennis had said. We have a lot of physical artifacts here that are historically important, and we need to protect them. But as recently as the past 20 years, most of the documentation is electronically based. And so, I felt very strongly about the fact that we need to put in some keeping mechanisms to make sure that the information resource is protected. And the thing that's very interesting about physical artifacts or electronic ones is you have to make some accommodation because of the media. And so, once again, I lean on my records retention schedule. So we've identified the information resource, and then we've defined how long it should be kept. And then we try to figure out some mechanisms, whether it be physical or electronic, which says this is how this item is going to be protected over time. One of the current problems that we're working on at Argonne right now is the separation of administrative backup tapes from archive data, because we've kind of twisted those things together in the past, and what we want to do is separate them so that we only use the administrative backup tapes for a contingency so that we can recover information, but we want the archive data saved back if it's a permanent retention in some way so that we can retrieve it and perhaps use it for a different purpose other than its original creation. So physical or electronic, it's both about preservation. The question is what kind of path you go down to be able to preserve the information.
Just a thing about archives tapes, our backup tapes from my experience. I have had numerous departments at both UWM and the city say, oh, we want to create a schedule for our backup tapes. And I've just been like, no, do not do that. Do not do that. Because, what ends up happening is you have to create a schedule so that you are retaining the longest retention requirement thing on that tape. And so you end up keeping all this junk or potentially compromising information. So yeah, that is a big thing. And so many people are like, oh yeah, we backed it up, we don't need to archive anything. No.
Right, yeah.
No.
I think you and Connie are stating it very well to say it just the way you did.
Mm-hmm.
That is an issue.
Well, we've run into the problem here when I started to ask people why we were keeping the backups as long as we were keeping them, and no one could answer that question. So what they have done at Argonne is listed all of the applications that they're currently using. And so what we're going to sit down is review the rotation schedule, and then once again, start to go through that arduous path of being able to separate archive data from backup data, because the backup data, in my opinion, can be kept for as long as the institution needs to keep it, and that is not for a very long period of time. But the archive data is a whole different story, because you want to keep that forever. And so, in my mind, there's got to be a bifurcation there. And because I think resources were tight in the beginning, and people were not really thinking about this in terms of recovering after a contingency or something else, a lot of things got twisted together that perhaps should not have been, put together. So it's an interesting puzzle to solve. So if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. So that leads nicely into my next. Well, Des, you have.
Go ahead. Well, I just wanted to say that the part about backup tape and backup systems has proved to be a vulnerability for companies who are being sued about various things. And there's some famous cases that we don't have to really talk about, but they're lessons about not archiving everything and trying to comply with what the law says and do that. If we don't have to hold X any longer than the law says, then we ought to follow that.
Right. Okay, so sort of following up on that leads me nicely into my next question. So how do you define historic or archival value in your position or positions? And, what kind of role has that kind of value played as in your creation of retention schedules?
I think I want to just talk about this a little bit. I was the beneficiary of always having the possibility of contacting people with archival knowledge, except in a private industry. That was a little more complicated. But in the public sector, fortunately, I was in a place where there were already procedures, and even though I could suspect that something might have historical value, I didn't have training in archives. And I appreciated being able to talk to people who I could call them on the phone and I could say, look, this is what's going on. Would you like to meet with me? You want to give a comment to them directly? You want to look at the documents? Let's consider that, both in terms of creation of the schedule and in terms of implementation of the schedule, because even though you have a schedule and it's aging the records like bottles of wine, some of them are going to start to become consumed. And sometimes this group of records may have something about somebody that's famous, an incident that's famous, or whatever it is, and they want to preserve that one, that file or that information. And that was a good procedure, and I liked the idea that I could turn to somebody, even people that were making an inquiry, and I could say, well, yeah, that might have it might be of historic importance, and it could be something that should go to an archive or historical society, but I'm going to bring them into this conversation. And so then that was good.
Dennis, we're gonna get to Connie's answer to this in a minute, but for the benefit of our viewers, who specifically are you bringing in on these kinds of questions? I know Colleges and Extension doesn't necessarily have its own archivist, and county doesn't have an official one. So, like, who are you talking to for this kind of stuff?
Well, in terms of UW Extension, the official status of the Madison archives was administratively through USAC was David Null. So we did have that established, and I did call him in lots of times. I was a familiar customer with him, and we sent all kinds of things to that archive, and that was good. And we did get advice from him about things, so this was good. In the county, the director of the County Historical Society was part of the committee as part of the Records Management Committee per ordinance. And so he was available to me, and that was important. And I used that whenever I wanted. It was helpful. And I can remember even a succession of directors of the County Historical Society. And we did have there was a unit, and I think there still is a unit of local government at the State Historical Society. And I'm not remembering her name right off the hand, but that was her turf, local government records.
Virginia Fritsch, probably.
Virginia Fritsch, exactly so. Mm-hmm. No, did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
All right. Connie?
Well, I've used peer review. When I came to Chicago, I joined up with ARMA right away and AIM right away, and there were several people within the professional organizations that were trained as archivists. The other thing that's very interesting on the corporate side of the board is there are some pretty spectacular corporate archives out there, and they have, types of items that they've collected and found value for their institutions. And so those are different series of records that you could think about keeping for your own institution. I was a member of not SAA, but also Midwest Archivist Conference, when I was very young in my career. So there were always people that I could go back to, that I had, were my teachers in school, that could help me with some decision making. But usually I would start to also talk to the end user, because the thing that was important to me was that even though in my records retention schedule, some records were identified as permanent, there were lots of records that had a shorter keeping period that potentially could become archival. And what I wanted to make sure of was that those things that could potentially be helpful to other people in the institution or the public at large were not destroyed. So, you know, in our schedule, there's another loop. And generally, when I'm sitting down with people that handle these records every day, I ask them point blank, do you think these are historically significant or could be archival? And, you know, when you start to put that question in front of people, they will give you serious answers. So sometimes for records that we deem archival, we keep everything. Sometimes we sample them. Sometimes we make a selection of items. And so that way we can protect, you know, not everything, but a portion of the documentation that was created.
Okay.
I could just say too, the forms that we used for creating schedules at the county level and at the state level, they have an obvious place to check the box about it being, we think it's historically significant, and you can check that with the archivist, and that's what I would do. But the other thing that I think comes up, and we had a procedure for it at the county, is that as the records aged, you still had a requirement to say, oh, by the way, we're going to destroy 100 boxes of this or that. And you have a chance to say again, even though you might have signed off earlier and said, no, I don't want them. This is the specific time period we're dealing with. Maybe that time period is significant for some reason. I don't know. And so I like the idea that there were those two junctures for talking about it. And it's similar in a way to having things at the state record center. They flag things for historical purposes as well. And so it's good.
Yeah. I'll just note from my perspective that I'm coming in after a records manager down here who didn't really have any archives training, and I'm coming across a lot of records that if I were scheduling them anew, I would say these should at least be looked at by the city archives at the Milwaukee Public Library. And you know, one of the things I'm running into is inertia. Like, people have had these schedules to say, you know, 5 years and destroy for 10 years, 20 years, and suddenly here's this new kid, relatively fresh-faced, and saying, oh, suddenly, oh, this is archival, and I think people don't really know what to do with that. So that's been one of my challenges. I don't know if either of you have run into that.
I can tell you, over my career, I saw the disposal of many, many, many thousands of boxes of records, and my regrets about, did I do the right thing? Did I notify people and so forth? I have zero regret, because really it was a pretty good system and I was happy with that. But I don't think everyone's situation is the same. You know, I think you may have some unique things going on with the City of Milwaukee records program, and it unfortunately requires a lot of review. That's just the way it is. Tough.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to our next question, which, you know, it's almost like I planned this. So in the archives profession, there's often this sort of characterization of records management as the first step or a preliminary step in archival appraisal. So what are your thoughts about that characterization, and what does appraisal mean to you as a records manager?
I can tell you, early in my career, I sort of didn't like to use the word appraisal, because it did seem to imply to me that we were talking about archives, and I didn't want people to get that idea. I did want them to realize that we were evaluating and considering what value the records have. And then I would list the values, and from a sort of business perspective, I would say, is it related to money that's to be collected? Is it fiscal? Is it, the legal requirements that you're aware of as a record keeper, which many times people said, oh yeah, I think there is a law or something like that, which was very helpful. And I would go down the line of different values, also including historical archival value. And that conversation with people who held the records was very important. I couldn't do without it. And often we'd be able to catch things. But I didn't want people to get the notion about the archive in particular, because the programming that I did, I never sold based on archives. I only sold it on based on, we can curtail costs, we can improve finding what we need when we need it, and those kind of things. And for me to go to somebody and say something about archives as a sort of opening line, that didn't work, because I knew that they might say to me, oh, you just got a historical side, don't you? Something like that. And that was good. It was good that we had that. But on the other hand, I wasn't really trying to sell records management based on archives. So I didn't want to go there.
Well, I think you I think appraisal is the beginning of the records management process. Institutions have to decide, and many do, that they want to have an archive or they don't want to have an archive. And if they don't want to have one, that's okay. I don't know that it's very forward-looking, but it's okay. But the other piece of it is that's what you pay people in this role to do. They have to appraise records. They have to assign value to them. And that's how you start to sort out what should be kept and what should not be kept. The thing I find very interesting about this is if you don't have a good records management program, you're not going to have a very good archive, because records can really start to earmark and protect things. People used to be fearful of talking to people in the records management department because they were afraid that we were going to throw everything away. And it was quite the contrary. And so it was an educational opportunity for a lot of people, in my opinion. I said, if you really need to protect something, we need to understand what that is so that we can make provision for it. And so that kind of changed the dynamic of the conversation. And, then we started to talk about, their output. And they agreed that some things were more important than other things. And they could help you decide what needed to be kept and what could eventually, go away. And so, the important lesson was somebody's got to set people down and help them make the evaluation. And somebody's got to record this and start to put some programs together so that you can start to apply retention requirements to the sets of holdings. And so that is a records management task, but if the keeping is of long term, that also becomes an archival task, because you've got to index this appropriately, and you've also got to make sure that the media is cared for over the long term. And that's not an easy thing to do for physical objects, and it's not an easy thing to do for electronic objects. But if you can start to sort through the information, you're on the right path, I believe, to be able to accomplish that goal. And that is my goal, is to apply the retention to the information resource.
I affirm what you're saying, Connie. I mean, the technique I used about talking about or changing the language about it was really geared at trying to get people to understand that there were these other values that were pretty important. Right. And so, for example, there's lots of things that were covered in state statute, particularly about court records, which were very numerous. Fortunately for me, in a very large project, and not just a project that I was doing, but a project that other people were doing in the court system, they had already established through Supreme Court rules in the state of Wisconsin. They laid out 66 different series that had specific retention periods, some of them 50 years or 75 years for a Class A felony or things like this. And, you know, the communication about that legal requirement was the thing I wanted to make sure people understood. They were in this, there's a comfort zone about that, and people needed to know that.
Right.
But the idea about evaluating or appraisal, I mean, it's sort of like, it's just two different ways of saying the same thing. And I was trying to be careful, though, about what I was selling, you know.
Yeah.
Dennis, I was very surprised to hear you say that you didn't really sell the archives part, because I've found in my sort of pitch that people are very vain. And to say, oh, you can be a part of history and help tell the story of your department or the city or university or whatever, that resonates with people. I've in my experience. And
I only used it when necessary, because some people were that way, but probably the world is divided into people are going to be pitchers and people who are keepers in a way. And so I was always trying to be sensitive to listen to that, you know. I mean, a lot of people, you could tell right away who was who, because they would have these concerns right away. And you could say, well, you know, if it's really long term, it's probably covered in statute, or maybe, you know, that we need to set a long retention schedule and so forth. But there was a lot of sorting out of things about, oh, when did you last look at those records? Oh, you have them in the closet? And so when did you go in there last? Well, I think I was in there in January. Oh, okay. So what was the time before that? I don't know. You know, there was some stuff that was laying around a long time, and you know, there were things that clearly needed to be get tossed. And needed to set a schedule for it.
I can agree with, I hear both of you, and it's like people want to keep things and just in case, and sometimes the just in case never happens. And then the other thing, when I was learning to be learning archiving, doing processing, I was so worried when I was in my salad days that I would throw the wrong thing away. And quite frankly, I didn't throw the wrong thing away. So it's like, it's a learning process. And, you know, you can get people on the bandwagon. I think now people are used to bantering around the word life cycle management. So whether they know what that means or not, they're a little more familiar with it because of our IT colleagues. So, you know, usually I, address it as a life cycle management issue, and we need to figure out what the life cycle of the information needs to be. Sometimes it's a short period of time, and sometimes it's a long period of time.
Okay. So I'm happy to hear you mention life cycle management, because that goes, again, right into my next question. To what extent, in your experiences, is the threshold between when something is handled by records management and when it's handled by archives meaningful? So, in other words, how would you define your place on the records life cycle or the records continuum or whatever we're calling it today?
I think you mean to say the records are in the records life cycle, not the records manager.
Right, but where do you come in? Where do you come in?
Well, I was seeing multiple points. I mean, we had the question in advance, and I read that, and I thought, who's in that life cycle now? But I think it's important for people to understand that there is a life cycle, and being able to tell people that, oh, you know what? Many records have a diminishing life that happens very quickly. And the records that are important today may not be important even next week, next month, or next year. And they have this diminishing aspect to them. And people need to understand that, because there is some comfort in knowing that there's a concept about that and that this is normal, right? But we do know that there are some which do seem to rate, we have to keep it a long time because of requirements in the law or regulatory things, but also because it could tell the story of our institution or of our program our research, or, you know, these kind of long-term things. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to communicate. But I see the points of interaction on the archival issues as in the what we call the evaluation or appraisal process at the beginning, identifying what the records are, connecting them to schedules that are approved and accepted by your corporation at a high level. And then also at the disposal end, in case there's things that become important that we didn't realize in the appraisal process. But I also see today a really important direction with programming at corporate levels where they say, you know what, there's this whole system that we need to evaluate for records, archives, compliance, privacy, blah, 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 a lot of different things. And we'll have our team, kind of an action team, go to that application and study that and make recommendations for improving it, identifying it, getting the schedules in connection with the SAP system or whatever kind of system it is, so that various things can be brought into proper compliance and so forth. And that idea about having these sort of action teams, and I've heard it described in literature and in person from people that I know, they say, oh, we do this and it's very important and we have our things to check off about, did they do this? Did they do this? And it presents a little different, we had this previously, even in paper record world, but it's more dynamic and more interesting and actually gets a lot of attention from the IT expert, the people who have specific knowledge about the system and things like that. And I think that's a wonderful dynamic to see in our future, and now we're seeing it now.
When the thing that has been a little odd for me is I've been thinking about lifecycle management for a long period of time, but my perspective is different because I'm thinking about it in terms of information. And, you know, I've got a lot of IT colleagues that, you know, we did lifecycle management at one of my previous companies, but it wasn't lifecycle management. It was application lifecycle management. All they cared about was protecting the application for long periods of time. They weren't really concerned about the information within the application. And so I think there's been this, you know, awareness that there's been a miss here. And that's becoming a more powerful voice now for the information resource opposed to the mechanism that, you know, that holds it. The thing that is interesting about electronic records is you've got to protect both of those things to be able to utilize machine readable records. So I think lifecycle is really important. Although we've saved a lot of things here, we haven't done a very good job about capture. Capture is really important to me. And then once it gets captured, putting it through some kind of workflow so it can go through that final evaluation process. And so when I think about records, I think about putting those systems together so that they work, so that you can either destroy or you can archive information, whether it be hard copy or electronic. And so that's really what I think about in terms of lifecycle management from a records manager or archivist point of view. It's the information. It's not necessarily the mechanism that needs to be, you know, evaluated and then protected or destroyed.
Okay. We have, let's see, time for another question, maybe question and a half. So what are the biggest challenges that you face or have faced as a records manager that you don't think archivists are necessarily aware of? And, you know, what could they do to make your life in this easier?
I don't know if they can make my life easier, but what I've been aware of looking at corporate institutions is the fact that people at very high levels of responsibility have walked away from the administrative responsibility for the information resources that they are supposed to oversee. They simply do not understand that they have a responsibility towards the information. They think that's somebody else's job. And in my opinion, it's one of the core components of their job because records management is really paid for through the administrative process. And if you don't do records management properly, you're not going to have any archival information. You know, we have this discussion at Argonne all the time. It's information management. And it's the fact that people do not understand that they have a relationship towards the information that is critical. And it's not just the high level, you know, leadership, it's everybody within the institution. They all have to do the right thing or information doesn't get captured and it doesn't get protected properly. And so I guess this is an exercise for us is, you know, helping people become more aware of that or a conscious raising endeavor so that we can make sure that information resources are protected because so many times I listen to people say, well, IT is taking care of that. And I can only assure you IT is not taking care of that and they have not taken care of it. And so the thing is, the owner of the information has got to be aware of that and has got to make some provision for, you know, capture, you know, how records are organized at a basic level and, you know, what we expect some of the outputs to be. You know, if I'm going to hire an employee, I have expectation and we write them down now that you're going to keep your office in an orderly manner. And if you're going to make work for me, you're going to put it in this location or you're going to submit that delivery this way because this is how the government wants it done. So that's the task at hand for me right now is to just make people more aware of this so that they can start to, you know, comply with the rules and regulations that are out there. And the bonus of a records retention schedule is at least you have identified the information resources and tied to that schedule the record keeping requirement. And that's how I've constructed my schedules. I do put the, you know, the statutory requirements. They're listed right in the schedule so people know why they're doing what they're doing.
Okay. Dennis, I want to hear from you in a minute. I just want to follow up with Connie. What do you think the role of computer-assisted retention is for making what you're talking about happen? And, you know, how far away are we, do you think?
You know, I keep talking about, or I keep listening to people say that, you know, there is, you know, appraisal dynamics that, you know, can help. I haven't actually seen it in my lifetime, and maybe I will see it in my lifetime. There is a tremendous amount of information out there. Everybody seems to be overwhelmed. I believe the power of real classification is that you can get like items grouped together and you can schedule huge swaths of information with the same keeping period. So this is not as onerous as it seems, but since people haven't actually been through the process, they see demons where perhaps none exist. But there is a tremendous amount of information. We've got 58 terabytes right now sitting in, you know, our box environment, and we've got, you know, more than one document management system at Argonne. So it's the fact that I think we all understand we can't keep keeping everything forever. The question is, what is a better way to start to winnow out the important from the unimportant? And in my opinion, you know, records management, if you follow the protocols, gives you a solution. Archiving gives you a solution if you follow the, you know, the protocols for these, you know, the information resource.
All right.
Just to follow up about what you were asking about, I think you're talking about auto classification.
Yes.
I have heard bad stories about that at conferences and so forth, but I also think that the application of that type of technology has to be employed and it has to be used, and it has to be used in a way that people have carefully developed the logic so that you don't have problems. It's not as though you shouldn't go there and have it, but it's a matter of, in a way, it takes me back to this business about the teams. You know, you could have an action team related to auto classification, taxonomy, and all this sort of stuff related to that one particular part of the SAP system or something like that, which has its own difficulties and challenges, regardless of whether you have good taxonomy and auto classification. It's just really, really complicated to pull those things apart in big database systems and things like that. But it doesn't mean we can't go there and we need to go there. It means we should be going there and we should be supported. One of the things that I've noticed as a tendency in records management in private industry is that the successful records management programs are often either tied to legal or IT. Now, of those two, I think that the connection to IT is very important. And in an era with technology the way it is, I think that is an important connection. And if the archivists and the records managers also are connected to that, that's just very important. And in a way, I can't stress that enough. I think that the legal, some records managers report up through a chain of command that basically takes them through the legal department. And that's okay, but it's going in a different direction. It's going in the direction of saying, well, e-discovery is really important, and our compliance issues are very important, and all that, and they are important. But the amount of money that might be available to people with IT, alliance, strong connection, that's where the resources are, I think.
Okay. So we've got about 3 minutes left. Do either of you have any sort of final thoughts, things I didn't ask that I should have?
No, I was struck by the set of questions you sent to us early on. I thought they were very good questions. It really covered the gamut of the relationship between records management and archiving. And if you have a total package, archiving's got to be part of the records management program. There isn't any ifs, ands, or buts about it. And part of the reason is you're always going to schedule records that are going to have a permanent retention. May not be a lot of them, but you're always going to have that. And then the question is, do you really want to flesh that out to, other areas of operation or other series? And I think it's tragic that that doesn't happen more often, because I think we are throwing away things that could be valuable to the institutions that these records come from.
Dennis, any final thoughts?
Well, Connie, that's very well stated, and I don't want to minimize the role of archives at all. In fact, I was always feeling good about having a relationship with people in archives and historical societies. And I think that there are important things that are being lost, partly as a result of the era that we live in, where people can have very temporary kind of electronic records that can be lost or even unrecoverable in some instances, things locked up in old media and all that sort of stuff. And some of the programming that I've heard coming out of UW-Madison, where they were sending people out with a kit to be able to go and say, oh, you have them in this old media, here's what we can do. I mean, it's just amazing, some of the things that can be done. Mm-hmm. So I think the future for people in records management and archives is bright, and I think it'll continue to be important.
Okay. That's about all the time we have. Thank you to Connie and Dennis for participating and sharing your insights on the records management world outside of the archival world. And thank you to everybody out there in internet land who is watching this. We hope you learned something from it. I think I did. Era, do you have any final things to say?
No additional final thoughts from me, except I want to thank you, Brad, and Connie and Dennis for joining us. And one quick plug I'll put out to anyone who's watching, who's a member of SAA, Nagara, or COSA, is that we will have a very exciting joint business meeting this year with the acquisitions and appraisal section. We're still, we haven't publicly announced everything that's going to be part of that, but I think it will be of interest. We're going to have some speakers, and we'll be talking about some very pertinent topics to the question of appraisal and transparency within a records management context. So
very good.
I want to say something good about Nagara. That was one of the first programs I saw. It was held at UW-Madison many years ago. I went to one of those, and that was very, very informative and very helpful. Mm-hmm. So that's a very good outfit.
I think it's
not to say there's nothing good about the other outfits. They're good too, but Nagara has a special place for me about local government records.
That's all I got, though. But I think we're right at time. So thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Sounds great.
Okay.